All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Alton, and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to Anderson House this evening for tonight's lecture. It's great to see so many new faces and familiar faces. So welcome. And we got a win on Mother Nature tonight. I'm 1 in 15 right now with the rain. If this is your first time joining us, the American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers and their French counterparts who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory and legacy of the American Revolution. In addition to tonight's program, the Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing changing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating for historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Tonight's lecture, a program that is made possible in part from a generous gift provided by the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, accompanies our current exhibition, a French Heroes Tour of the American Republic. And if you haven't seen that yet, it is right behind me in the billiard room, so I encourage you to do that after tonight's talk. And tonight's program features Alan Hoffman, who is the president of the American Friends of Lafayette, and Chuck Schwam, who is the executive director of the American Friends of Lafayette. And between the two of them, you will learn all about the Marquis de Lafayette, his farewell tour of 1824 and 25, its significance, and the commemorative events that are planned to celebrate its upcoming bicentennial. So on to our first speaker, Mr. Chuck Schwam. Not only is Chuck the executive director of the American Friends of Lafayette, he is also the committee chair of the Lafayette Farewell Tour Bicentennial effort that oversees 50 nationwide committees dedicated to commemorating the tour. So to kick things off this evening, he will discuss the big plans that are in store that are being hosted by the American Friends of Lafayette, and he will be the one to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Alan Hoffman, who will discuss the Lafayette and the tour itself. So with that, and without further delay, I will stop talking, and would you please join me in welcoming our friend, Mr. Chuck Schwam.
Thank you, everybody. Frankly, I got to be honest with you, I'm a little nervous tonight because usually I'm sitting there. I've come to many of lecture here and I've never been on this side of the podium. So being on this side of the podium is a little different than being on that side, but I just wanted to say I'll get through it. I wanted to say thank you very much to the Executive Director Morse. Andy, you're just a wonderful partner and become a friend, and I really appreciate you so much for having us here. Andrew Alton, thank you so much for not only having Alan and I here tonight, but also over the course of the rest of the year, other AFL members will be speaking at events here at Anderson House, and I appreciate the opportunity for us to do that. And Emily Parsons, who couldn't be with us tonight, the Fête Lafayette, the exhibition. If you haven't seen it, it is unbelievable. She's responsible for it amongst other people as well. And I just wanted to thank Emily from the bottom of my heart for bringing Lafayette to the forefront right here in one of the most important buildings, I think, in our country. The American Friends of Lafayette were founded in 1932 at Lafayette College. We have a membership approaching 1,000. As I speak, we're growing to the tune of almost 3 new members every single day. It's hard to keep up with, to be honest with you. And it's all about Lafayette and the excitement that is happening because Lafayette is coming back. So the American Friends of Lafayette, I want to show the first slide. This has nothing to do with the tour, but I want to talk about the American part of the American Friends of Lafayette. And this is where Lafayette was born. It still stands today. And you'll notice there's an American flag flying there. I think that's very interesting, a French and American flag. By the way, Lafayette was born in this room right here, and he was raised in that chateau. This is many years later, in 1824. This is Castle Clinton in New York. It still exists. And on August 16th, Lafayette arrived at Castle Clinton and almost stepped on American soil for the first time in 40 years. I'm going to explain almost in a minute. But that place still exists. And guess where we'll be on August 16th, 2024? Right here. welcoming Lafayette back to New York. For 13 months, Lafayette came back, nearly 400 days, and we're planning events on at least 250 of those days. I used to have black hair. That's 6,000 miles, 24 states, and Washington, D.C., and West Virginia, which wasn't a state yet. It was part of Virginia, but he went to Wheeling. Lafayette was the first official rock star in America. And this graph shows you exactly why, because look at this. Almost 65% of New York showed up for him to come. Only less than 6.06% for the Beatles. Lafayette, the first American rock star. James Monroe, the president of the United States in 1824, and Congress invited Lafayette back to sort of heal the country. It was going through a tough time. It was a tough time we were going through a very rough election. The country was divided. People were fighting amongst each other. Sound familiar? That was happening in 1824. And by the way, guess what? Lafayette came back as the only living continental general, and he did what he was supposed to do. He did bring back patriotic feelings. He did help heal the country. It was really an amazing feat. We're going to follow his footsteps exactly as he did 200 years ago. And we're going to celebrate him in three ways. We're going to celebrate, commemorate, and educate the public about three things. Number one, Lafayette, not only as a savvy general, which he was, but also as an abolitionist, as a feminist, as a friend of Native Americans, as an advocate for the freedom to worship however you like. He even helped countries get rid of their despotism and their problems with royalty in places like Poland and Bolivia and Greece, just to name a few. He supported prison reform. These are things that Lafayette really, really believed in. And as other people are toppling statues of historic figures, we're raising statues of Lafayette because of these human rights situations. We want to teach people that those existed then and they still exist now. The Franco-American alliance, that's something we really want to make sure people understand. Our oldest ally, almost 250 years, friendly the whole time, a staunch supporter of the United States and us of them. At Yorktown, the final major battle of the American Revolution, there were more French military personnel in attendance than American. Think about that. If it wasn't for the French, we'd be eating fish and chips for dinner every night. And the last thing I want to make sure we educate the public about is how important history is. And this is where this place and us, we share the same values. History is important. All the questions about the future can be answered simply by looking in the past. We keep making the same mistakes over and over again as human beings. History is important, just as important as math and science. As I travel around the country and talk to towns, thank you very much. As I travel around the country and talk to towns about the bicentennial, we're offering them several things to help them boost their events as Lafayette comes through their town 200 years later. Number one, we're offering a Lafayette interpreter, a Lafayette person that speaks French, comes to their town, and is Lafayette for them for the day. Number two, our museum grade panels that you saw out there. Those panels, we have 12 sets. They're going to be traveling around the country throughout 2024 and 2025. We're going to do promotion through social media. Where our social media presence, thanks to our social media coordinator, Kat Smith, is blowing up. We have like 200,000 followers. I don't even know what that means, but it's a big number. And I think it's important. And I think it has a lot to do with why we're growing so fast. So we're going to make sure we promote the events not only in social media, but press media, press releases, print media, and local TV stations. Also, we're going to offer guidance. In other words, we know what happened. We have the records. We have the newspaper articles. We know what Lafayette ate. We know what he said. We know what the toasts were. We know in each specific place what can happen, what did happen, so they can recreate it. We can offer speakers that can speak of their events. The music committee, headed by David Hildebrand, is doing an amazing job gathering all the music that was played for Lafayette when he was here for those 13 months. We have the sheet music, and we'll be sharing it with the committees so music can be played that's appropriate at their events. And our education committee. Marcy Toma is the committee chair there. We've developed 7 lesson plans for school children, K through 12, around the country. That's what we should be doing, teaching our youth about the importance of history in Lafayette. We have many partners that are helping us around the country. Obviously, the Society of Cincinnati, thank you very much, both financially and otherwise. The DAR, the SAR, Alliance Francaise, and the Masons, just to name a few. The Masons and the Society of Cincinnati were important because they came out in droves when Lafayette was around. As a matter of fact, I don't know if Lafayette would have even come to America if he wasn't a Mason. So the Masons are very much involved with our bicentennial efforts. When I travel around, I got to say what I find very interesting when I go to some of the small towns like in Ohio, Marietta, or in Illinois or whatnot, it's still, Lafayette's visit is still the most important thing that happened in that town. Think about that for a second. 200 years later, they're still talking about it. It's amazing. It gives me goosebumps. When they took him around in 1824, they wanted Lafayette to see the most modern technology they have. And I know the word technology sounds weird when you're talking about early 19th century, but there was, like Jug Bridge up in Frederick was an engineering marvel, or the Erie Canal, for instance, or the penitentiary in Philadelphia, which, by the way, he did not like at all because it was solitary confinement. And the waterworks in Philadelphia. They wanted to show off the latest stuff that was happening. Also, they sent him to see natural wonders. Lafayette had never seen Niagara Falls, so they took him to see Niagara Falls. And we'll be there in June of 2025. Believe it or not, Lafayette saw 10 presidents during the course of 1824 and 1825. I'm going to name them for you. Well, he visited he visited George Washington's tomb. He visited John Adams. He visited Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, of course, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and then future presidents, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Harrison, and John Tyler. That's a lot of presidents in one tour. He met a lot of important people. This picture, I got to say something about this image real quick. This is the new tomb at Mount Vernon. Lafayette did not visit the new tomb. He visited the old tomb at Mount Vernon. This didn't exist. This is a much later image of Lafayette visiting Washington's tomb. So in case you guys are going to question this, you're right. It is incorrect. But it's still good looking. Let's see here. I'd like to just go over really quickly the flow of our 13-month tour. We're starting on August 15th in Staten Island. Actually, he did show up on Sunday, August 15th, 1824, but they didn't want to publicly put him out there because it was a Sunday. So he stayed with Vice President Daniel Tompkins that night in Staten Island, and we're going to hold our initial dinner there in Staten Island to celebrate that. But then the next day, we're getting off a ship. We're having them parade him up Broadway. We have a big thing going on at City Hall. It's going to be a big to-do, just like it was 200 years earlier. And then after that, he heads up to New England, where we're actually having trouble keeping up with him. He sees so many towns in one day in a horse and buggy. We're having trouble keeping up with him in a car. Traffic, roads, it's just so different. It's very interesting that he was able to see sometimes seven or eight stops in one day. In Connecticut on September 6th, we're going to have a big birthday party for him. On September 7th, this is an important date, we're going to hold a scholarly symposium on Lafayette at Fairfield University. Later in September, we'll be up at West Point. We're doing a whole week in the Hudson River Valley. That's going to be beautiful. Then down to New Jersey, Princeton, Trenton. Then on September 28th, we'll be in Philadelphia. They have big plans there, a parade there as well, a big dinner at the Masonic Hall there. October 7th, one of my favorite dates. I'm going to tell you a little bit about October 7th. So when Lafayette got off the boat at Fort McHenry in Baltimore, he looked up the hill and he saw a line of the National Guard. And the National Guard, our National Guard, is named after the National Guard that he started in Paris during the French Revolution. So he sees the National Guard, he starts walking up the hill, and they part. And behind them is George Washington's dining tent. Well, he breaks down and cries. Think about how much time he spent in that tent. Councils of war, meals with the man that he loves so much. He just broke down and cried. Well, guess what we're doing? We're doing the same thing. The museum in Philadelphia, the American Revolution Museum, is lending us the tent. The National Guard will be there. We're going to do exactly what he did, and hopefully my interpreter will be able to cry on cue. Then the first day in Washington, D.C. is October 12th, and we're hoping to have a White House event that day. It's been a little dicey with dealing with the White House up until now, but they're busy. You got to give them credit. We're also going to hold a State Department event that week, an event at Tudor Place, at the Navy Yard, and of course, right here at Anderson House on October 13th. So I hope you join us. Then we start heading into Virginia. Big day in Alexandria on the 16th. Then this day is the 17th at Mount Vernon, where we'll recreate Lafayette going to the old tomb 3 times that day. And we're very excited about that. I mean, think about what Lafayette must have gone through Lafayette's mind that day as he walks into the tomb of a man that he hasn't seen in 40 years. Amazing. Then we're down to Yorktown. Yorktown's going to be probably our highest attendance of any event we're going to have. We expect maybe as many as 10,000 people in Yorktown. If you've never been to Yorktown on October 19th, which is Surrender Day, I highly, highly recommend it. It is a very special day. It's a slice of Franco-Americana. Then we head down to, on the November 15th, we do a big weekend in Charlottesville with UVA, Monticello, and Montpelier. Fredericksburg will be there the weekend of November 22nd. And then another big day, not to take Fredericksburg's a big day, but on December 10th, 1824, Lafayette was the first foreigner to give a foreign address, an address to the joint session of Congress. And on December 10th, Speaker Johnson is going to allow us to be at the Capitol to celebrate that event. And we're very excited about that, December 10th. Put that on your calendar. Then the weekend of December 13th will be in Annapolis. And then we finish 2024 in Frederick, Maryland on the last weekend of 2024. Then Lafayette kind of took it easy over the winter because it was hard to get around with the weather and whatnot. He visited Baltimore, he visited a few towns around DC, but then come spring, he heads south. He heads south through Virginia and into North Carolina, where he visits the first town ever named after him, and the only town he visits named after him, Fayetteville, North Carolina. Now there's 80 of them, right? But that town was the only one he visited named after him. Then on to Charleston and Savannah in Georgia. Then we go to Alabama, Fort Mitchell, for instance. The Creek Indians have agreed to carry Lafayette across the Chattahoochee River just like they did 200 years later. They wouldn't let him get his feet wet. They actually carried him across the river. We're going to do that again. April of 2025, New Orleans. I mean, that's going to just be a blowout. That town is, I mean, they're already planning. Their budget is $250,000. It's unbelievable what's going to happen in New Orleans. Then we head west. The furthest west Lafayette goes, it's a tie between Natchez, Mississippi, and St. Louis, Missouri. And then he goes to Illinois, Tennessee, Indiana, where I hope to recreate a shipwreck. I got to get a permit on sinking a ship. Good luck with that. I'm going to do it. You're going to see a shipwreck. And then on to Kentucky, where he's Louisville, Lexington, and Versailles. They call it in Kentucky, Versailles. Then Western Pennsylvania, like Pittsburgh. Then up to Central New York, Western New York, Buffalo. Then a big date in June. Is it June, Bunker Hill? So he was rushing to get back to lay the cornerstone at the Bunker Hill Monument. He really wanted to do that. And there's some great images of that. We're going to make a big deal of that. And so it was a big deal to him. But one of the things he did that day is he gathered a whole big box of earth. And you're going to talk about that, aren't you? All right, but from that area. Okay, thank you. So, and he's buried in the earth from Bunker Hill. So that's a big day for us too. And then another big day is July 4th in New York, 2025. We've partnered with America 250. And we expect them to be a very big part of that. It's our 199th birthday. And Lafayette was in New York on July 4th of 1825. And then the final weekend will be right here in Washington, D.C. September 6th, we're going to have another birthday bash. That's 2 birthday bashes in one tour. And then we're going to sail them down the Potomac past Mount Vernon as we say goodbye to Lafayette forever. Okay. The hair has turned gray. Hopefully this time next year I still have it. This is probably Alan might disagree with, the most famous portrait of him from the tour. It is done by an artist named Ari Scheffer. What I think is most important about this painting is this. This is the chambers. This is where the president, for instance, gives the State of the Union address. And there's only two portraits in there. One of them is that portrait, and it's right there. And the other one is George Washington. So when the president's standing there, looking over his shoulder is Lafayette and George Washington. Amazing stuff. Lafayette lived another 10 years after the tour, 9 years, excuse me, and he died in May 20th, 1834. Alan probably will talk about that a little more. I wanted to talk about this. This is where Lafayette is buried. That is the flag that flies over Lafayette's grave. It's flown there since World War I, when Pershing liberated France, and he came to Lafayette's grave, the very first place he went. Even when Hitler occupied France, he didn't mess with that American flag. And this is the ceremony once a year on July 4th. We are part of that ceremony. We change the American flag that flies over his grave. I'm going to ask you to please, please look us up on Lafayette200.org if you're interested in helping with the bicentennial or simply joining the American Friends of Lafayette. You can contact me through there, Lafayette200.org. Now it's time to introduce my boss. I'm going to do it very well, I promise. Alan Hoffman obtained his BA in history from Yale before earning a JD at Harvard Law School. He practiced law in Boston for 50 years. An avid reader of American history, he discovered Lafayette in 2002 and spent 2 years translating Auguste Lavassier's Lafayette in America in 1824-1825. This is the firsthand account of Lafayette's farewell tour written by his private secretary. This translation was published in 2006, and it's in its third printing. President Hoffman has lectured widely on Lafayette, over 200 talks, and has spoken in each of the 24 states with Lafayette visited during the tour. Alan has written scholarly articles about Lafayette and is the principal author of the virtual travelogues covering Lafayette's farewell tour visits in 4 states, New York, Virginia, North Carolina, and New Hampshire. Alan is an officer of 2 Lafayette societies. He currently serves as president of the American Friends of Lafayette and the Massachusetts Lafayette Society. He is the president as well. I wish you enjoyed Alan's speech. He does a great job. Boss, you're up.
So Chuck just handed off the clicker to his trusty sidekick, Bonnie Fritz, which is a good thing because I am inept in advancing slides. So I always assign that task to someone else. Firstly, I'd like us to give Chuck a big hand for his wonderful speech. My major criticism is he didn't leave me too much to say. But, I want to thank Chuck for his nice introduction, and I want to thank Andy here for setting this event up. And you're going to thank Andy too, because he gave me a strict time limit. When I first started talking about Lafayette, I felt I could just go on and on and on. And one time, I was in my home state of New Hampshire at the American Canadian Genealogical Society, and it was just before lunch, and I'm going on, and the person who invited me, her name was Pauline Cousson. I see her leave the room in the back and I hear her heels walking down the hallway, and she's standing right there. And I was, I got distracted. I said, Pauline, how many minutes do I have left? And her answer was -10. So it's a good thing that Andy gave me this time limit. I hope you didn't count that time in my time. All right. So we're going to start with the first slide, Bonnie. In 1846, Ensign and Thayer of New York published a colored broadside entitled The Pictorial History of the United States. In addition to depicting the seals of all the states and territories, it had printed information about the census from 1790 and 1840 and battles of the American Revolution and the War of 1812, important other events in American history. But you see in the middle, there are three major figures. Washington in the center, Franklin to his left, on his good right hand, Lafayette. Not Adams or Hamilton or Madison, Monroe or Jackson, but a Frenchman, Lafayette. Why was that? In the 19th century and into the 20th century, Lafayette's reputation in America was extraordinary. He was already popular before he arrived for his farewell tour in 1824. He was popular by virtue of his important role in the Revolution, his subsequent activities on behalf of his adopted land, America, his close friendship with George Washington, and his storybook life. However, this trip, during which he toured all 24 states and was treated as a conquering hero wherever he went, reaffirmed his reputation and elevated him into iconic status. As Chuck pointed out, it was like the Beatles. And the only other analogy that I could think of really is the visit of John Paul II in 1979. The result was that Lafayette's name was firmly imprinted on the American psyche. When state banks printed legal tender, Lafayette's face appeared on bills in more states than anyone except George Washington. Scores of counties, cities, towns, and townships, actually about 80 in number, were named either Lafayette, Fayette, Lafayetteville, Fayetteville, LaGrange, and there's even one or two LaGrangevilles. LaGrange was the chateau that he lived in from approximately 1800 to 1834 when he wasn't in Paris. The next slide is an image of the Chateau LaGrange. There are countless streets, squares, and parks. Of course, we have Washington Park here, Lafayette Park here in Washington. There are 8 streets named for Lafayette in the city of Boston and 12 in the 5 boroughs of New York, just by way of example. Numerous statues and monuments were built. Daniel Chester French's Lafayette Monument stands in Prospect Park, Brooklyn. That's the next slide. It's my favorite. I grew up in Brooklyn, not in that neighborhood, but it's a beautiful monument. After France gave America the Statue of Liberty, America reciprocated. An equestrian statue of Lafayette by Paul Wayland Bartlett was given to France in 1908. It was called the Children's Statue because it was paid for by coins collected by millions of American school children. It stood outside the Louvre until the I.M. Pei Pyramid was constructed in the 60s, which event caused its removal to a much more obscure spot on the right bank of the Seine. That's the children's statue. And I'll show you one more. By the way, before I show you one more, an exact copy of that statue stands outside the State House in Hartford, Connecticut. And the next slide is Washington and Lafayette by Bartholdi in Lafayette Square, Manhattan, at the southern tip of Morningside Park. Mount Lafayette was named by the good people of New Hampshire in 1824. Lafayette College in Easton was named, and John Bessica will correct me if I'm wrong, in 1826, but save it for later. There is a Lake Lafayette in northern Florida and a Lafayette River in southern Virginia. Now, Lafayette decided to return to America for one last visit after he received President James Monroe's invitation in early 1824. He had just lost his seat in the Chamber of Deputies in February that year. In July, he departed for America with his son, George Washington Lafayette, with Auguste Levasseur, his private secretary, who kept a journal of the trip, and a valet aboard the Cadmus, an American packet ship. This trip, the farewell tour, was a unique event in our history, if not the history of the world. Now, you may think that what I just said was hyperbole. However, I was by no means the first one to say that. Contemporaries felt that way. In 1830, Edward Everett wrote a review of Lafayette in America in 1824 and 1825, Lafayette's secretary's firsthand account of the farewell tour. In it, he praised the book, Lafayette and the Farewell Tour. About the tour, he wrote, and I quote, "An event taken in all its parts, unparalleled in the history of man." Here is this 67-year-old man, tall but somewhat portly, who walks with a limp and a cane and wears a hairpiece, who has wielded, I have nothing against hairpieces, by the way, but it's just a fact, who has wielded no military power or governmental authority since 1792, when he served as a general in defense of France, who then held no public position at all in either country. And he's treated like a conquering hero, like a Caesar or an Alexander, for 13 months in every corner of this vast country. There are parades, militia reviews, dinners, banquets, balls, meet and greets with school children and with private societies, most prominently the Masons, who greeted him wherever he went, and the Society of the Cincinnati, who greeted him. And often each of those organizations held dinners for him. His birthday dinner, for example, in 1824 was one of those. Triumphal arches are constructed in cities large and small, welcoming Lafayette. Americans of all races, each gender, and every age wanted to touch this man who had done so much for their country. A whole cottage industry of consumer goods was created. You know, every time I gave closing argument in my law practice, my nose ran. So I try to bring tissues whenever I give a speech. A whole cottage industry of consumer goods was created. There are Lafayette prints, fans, hats, buttons, bandanas, medallions, sheet music, bottles, brushes, baby shoes, ribbons. The next slide is a Lafayette ribbon worn by the school children of Boston in 1825. There are Lafayette scarves. The next slide is a Lafayette scarf from Philadelphia, also dated 1824. There are Staffordshire and other ceramics, including a set of dishes depicting Lafayette's arrival at Castle Garden in New York City. And there are ladies and actually men's kid gloves with his face imprinted on it. You see the one on the right is Lafayette and Washington as well, whom he was often paired with on these items. Numerous American painters wanted to paint him from life. The two most famous, perhaps, are the Samuel Morse portrait. He won the commission of the city of New York, and this is now in City Hall, New York, and we're going to see it in 2024 when we go to New York in August. And the next one is the Thomas Sully, the Philadelphia painter, who also painted Lafayette from life. On August 15th, 1824, the Cadmus arrived in New York Bay. The next slide is the only known portrait of the Cadmus. It's in the Penobscot Maritime Museum in Maine. As Levasseur contemplated Staten Island to his left, he wrote, "The noise of a cannon caught my attention from another side. It was the artillery of Fort Lafayette, which was announcing the arrival of the Cadmus to the city of New York." Because it was a Sunday, Lafayette disembarked in Staten Island and stayed at the home of the then Vice President Daniel Tompkins. On the following day, he arrived in the Battery at Castle Garden at the southern tip of Manhattan on the Chancellor Livingston, which was a steamship, coastal steamship that was chosen to bring Lafayette, accompanied by a numerous flotilla of boats, and was welcomed by all the military authorities and dignitaries of the city. And the crowd estimates for that day range from 50,000 to 200,000. The next slide is a 19th century portrait of Fort Lafayette in the harbor. The next slide is one of those pieces of Staffordshire china showing Lafayette's arrival at Castle Garden. You see the planks. Castle Garden was in the water at that time, and in order to get to it, they built like a bridge to get to it. And now the next slide shows Castle Garden today, and all that land has been filled in. So now it's actually on land. Having been feted in New York City, Lafayette headed for Boston on August 20th on the Old Post Road. He arrived in Roxbury, which was then a near suburb, a little after midnight on the 24th, after he had stopped in several cities in Connecticut and in Providence, Rhode Island. On the morning of the 24th, he headed to Boston from the Shirley Eustace House, which was then the governor's mansion in Roxbury, in a procession of 70,000, according to the newspapers. He crossed the Boston Common to the State House, where he was addressed by the governor and replied. He was escorted to apartments that the city alderman had prepared for him, sparing no expense. I'm going to tell you the story of those apartments because it illustrates what the cities and towns did to honor Lafayette and to prepare for his visit. The backstory to the apartments, which Lafayette stayed in from August 24th until he left Boston on September 2nd, was told in an exhibition catalog that the exhibition was at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The catalog is called Rather Elegant Than Showy, the Classical Furniture of Isaac Vos, who was a high-end furniture maker at the time. To summarize, the alderman rented a portion of the Amory House at 22 Beacon Street and gorgeously furnished it. As the authors write, the city of Boston hired only the most respected craftsmen for the furnitures, Vos and Sons for furniture and lighting, and Hedges for upholstery, draperies, and carpeting. Consistent with this high standard, they selected the city's leading gilder and looking glass maker, John Doggett. He billed the city for a loan of 2 pairs of looking glasses, 1 pair valued at an extraordinary $425. Now, the Vos furniture consisted of 78 items, including this beautiful rosewood couch. Mr. Doggett also provided 5 Gilbert Stuart paintings, one of each of the presidents, so that Lafayette would be among his friends when he stayed in Boston. Moreover, the city hired a barouche with 4 white horses for Lafayette's use. In the afternoon of the 24th, there was a dinner at the Exchange Tavern in Boston. Lafayette later visited John Hancock's widow at her home in the evening. This visit is memorialized in Louisa May Alcott's An Old-Fashioned Girl, which she wrote in about 1869. While this is a work of fiction, the story has the ring of truth to it because Louisa May Alcott's mother, Abby May, Abby May, her last name was May, was a cousin of Dorothy Quincy Hancock, and she would have been present when Lafayette arrived in Boston. So in this story, Alcott tells, a grandmother is telling her 2 grandchildren and a family friend the story of Lafayette's visit. And this is what Alcott wrote. Well, by and by, the general, escorted by the mayor, drove up. Dear me, I see him now. A little old man in nankeen trousers and vest, a long blue coat and ruffled shirt. He was leaning on his cane, for he was lame, and smiling and bowing like a true Frenchman. As he approached, 3 old ladies rose and curtsied with the utmost dignity. Lafayette bowed first to the governor's picture, then to the governor's widow, and kissed her hand. That was droll, for on the back of her glove was stamped Lafayette's likeness, and the gallant old man kissed his own face. Then some of the young ladies were presented, and as if to escape any further self-salutations, the Marquis kissed the pretty girls on the cheek. Yes, my dears, here is just the spot which the dear old man saluted me. I'm quite as proud of it now as I was then, for he was a brave, good man, and he helped us in our trouble. While in Boston, Lafayette visited Harvard College twice, first for the graduation ceremonies and then for a Phi Beta Kappa dinner where Edward Everett gave the address. Now, Edward Everett was not known for short addresses. He's the man who spoke at Gettysburg for 2 hours before Lincoln's 2 minutes. On the 29th of August, Lafayette visited John Adams in Quincy. On the 31st, he headed north stopping in Chelsea, Lynn, Marblehead, Salem, Beverly, Ipswich, and Newburyport. Now, it rained that day, 7, yeah. It rained that day, and there were events in every locus, collations, dinners, etc. Citizens of New Hampshire joined the frenzy surrounding Lafayette's visit on September 1 at Portsmouth. Although Lafayette proved to be a magnet for all Americans, veterans, particularly veterans of the American Revolution, hastened to greet him. September 1 happened to be the day of Franklin Pierce's graduation from Bowdoin College. As Peter Wallner writes in his biography of New Hampshire's only president, Franklin had been selected to give the honorary oration in Latin, and he wrote his father, General Benjamin Pierce, who was a veteran of Bunker Hill, among other battles, hoping he would attend the ceremony. Wallner writes, in this he was disappointed, however, as the old general joined other Revolutionary War soldiers at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to honor General Lafayette, who was on the famous tour of the United States. So he dissed his son's college graduation valedictory address to spend time with Lafayette. After visiting Portsmouth and returning to Boston, Lafayette headed west to Lexington, Concord, and Worcester on its return for a second visit to New York City. The next slide, actually, we can go back to the glove. This is a glove like the ones worn in Boston in 1824. And the next slide is a banner. This is the prized possession of the Lexington Historical Society. It was on an evergreen in Lexington Green as Lafayette approached. You can't tell from this slide. It's 39 feet long. It's cloth painted with green paint. Welcome, friend of America, to the birthplace of American liberty. By the way, after Lafayette's departure, the Boston aldermen conducted an auction to try to recoup their great investment in the furnishings that they had provided for Lafayette's comfort. Lafayette went back to New York City. There was one event which was very important. It was a fete at Castle Garden, which kind of set the standard for many events throughout the country. He left New York City again in September and headed west through New Jersey to Philadelphia and then southward. He arrived at Yorktown to celebrate the Surrender Day, October 19th. This may have been the first actual celebration of that day, 43 years after the battle. He reached Monticello on November 4th and spent about 10 days with Jefferson and then a few days with Madison at Montpelier. He spent much of the winter, as Chuck said, in Washington City, making a number of side trips. Although his original intent was to visit only the first 13 states, he decided by this time to accept the invitations that he had received for all the other states. Thus, he left Washington City on February 23rd for his southern and western campaigns. After stopping in places in Virginia and North Carolina, he entered South Carolina. In Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, an incident occurred that encapsulates this man who made no distinction on account of race, color, or creed. In many of the southern states, local officials had barred African Americans, whether enslaved or free, from attending all the public events, the parades or the militia reviews. And Columbia was one of those. And this was because Lafayette had a reputation which preceded him as a long-term advocate for the abolition of slavery. In an autobiographical sketch of Dr. Maurice Moore, who was a militiaman on duty that day when Lafayette visited Columbia on March 11, 1825, he describes this incident. The incident occurs at a private reception for Lafayette after a parade and a militia review. 2 sentinels with fixed bayonets on their guns were posted to prevent the entrance of intruders. Officers, however, were allowed to enter unquestioned. Here I saw a strange but pleasant incident transpire. An old African, neatly dressed, came to the front door and started in, but the sentinels interposed their bayoneted guns to bar his entrance. The old man contemptuously pushed them aside, saying, "Shaw, Shaw, see guns afore you was born, been where they've been shot by soldiers too," and without further opposition from anyone, gained his way. He came straight to the room where the distinguished guest was standing among the crowd and said, "I come to see General Lafayette." Lafayette turned, looked at him, and remarked, "An old acquaintance. Don't tell me who it is." The Negro advanced to the Marquis and, bowing, held out his hand and said, "Howdy, Master Lafayette. How you do, sir? You remember me?" "Yes." "Stop. Don't tell me your name." "Ah, I have it. Pompey, belonging to Colonel Buchanan, the first servant who waited on me when I came to America. When I landed at Georgetown, I was taken first to the camp of General Buchanan near there, and Pompey waited on me," said he, as he warmly shook the old man's hand. The nobleman called for a glass of champagne with Pompey, which that worthy took with great dignity. Then he put out his hand and said, "Goodbye, Master Lafayette. We getting old. We'll never meet again. God bless you." They shook hands again. Pompey went out, mounted his pony, and started for his home near Winnsboro, saying he'd come to see General Lafayette. Now he'd done that, he was going home. By the way, those Southern officials were right to be concerned about Lafayette's influence. Lewis Hayden, an enslaved boy in Lexington, Kentucky, when Lafayette arrived in May of 1825, tells this story in a memoir that he wrote many years later. Now, Lewis Hayden's and Harriet Hayden's house are on the African-American Freedom Trail in Boston. He became an abolitionist. He was a politician in Boston after the Civil War, etc. He's quite an accomplished man. And in any event, he writes, Lafayette was in full march under the town military escort. I went a mile to meet them and found the fences lined with people. Lafayette was in a barouche drawn by 4 horses, and as he passed the people, he bowed to them on both sides. When he passed me, he bowed to the fence I was on. I looked around and saw no one else on the fence, and what did I do but roll right down on the ground, frightened almost to death. As I did so, it was come foot, help body, for I never stopped running until I got under the guns that were to fire the salute. Lafayette was the most famous man I'd ever heard of, and you can imagine how I felt, a slave boy, to be favored by his recognition. That act burnt his image upon my heart so that I never shall need a permit to recall it. I date my hatred of slavery from that day, and I tell you that after, I allowed no moving thing on the face of the earth to stand between me and my freedom. So just the mere recognition of a boy like that was significant to his entire life. After Lafayette's Southern and Western tours, he returned to Boston for the laying of the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument, one of a number of Masonic ceremonies that Lafayette participated during the farewell tour. In Daniel Webster's Bunker Hill address before a crowd of 45,000, he spoke directly to Lafayette at one point, who was seated in an armchair in front of the surviving veterans of the Battle of Bunker Hill and the American Revolution. And he said, "Heaven saw fit that the electric spark of liberty should be conducted by you from the New World to the Old," referring to his roles in both the American and the French revolutions. Lafayette then made a second trip to New Hampshire, this time to the capital city of Concord. Benjamin Pierce was all over Lafayette on this trip. He hosted a banquet at which 200 veterans were present on the State House lawn. So he really didn't have to diss his son's graduation the year before. In order to accomplish his goal of visiting all 24 states, Lafayette headed east to Maine on June 23rd, 1825, returning to Concord on the morning of the 27th. He then departed Concord at midday, heading west. After spending the night in Claremont, New Hampshire, he departed on the 28th in a basket wagon, the next slide, belonging to Dr. Leonard Jarvis, traveling north along the Connecticut River to Cornish, where he crossed the bridge to Windsor, and the carriage relinquished its precious cargo to the authorities of Vermont, the last state that Lafayette visited, or the 24th. Now that carriage came down in the Jarvis family. It was given to the what used to be called the Long Island Museum of Art, History, and Carriages, but they rebranded themselves. They're now the Long Island Museum, but they have a big barn with a lot of carriages in it. After Vermont, Lafayette traveled back to New York City for the July 4th celebrations. As he left New York on July 14th, a militia unit that had renamed itself National Guard in honor of Lafayette's service in the Parisian National Guard saw him off. The next slide is a poster after a painting that the National Guard commissioned in 1989, the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. And the legend, which doesn't show up on this slide, tells the story of this and says that by the end of the 19th century, every state militia in the country had renamed itself National Guard in honor of Lafayette. Like Churchill in World War II, Lafayette lived in the White House in August and September with his friend John Quincy Adams. On September 7th, 1825, Adams sent Lafayette off aboard a new frigate named the Brandywine in honor of Lafayette's service in the Battle of the Brandywine, where he was wounded, shedding his blood for the American cause. While in America, Lafayette was the first foreigner to address a joint session of Congress, as I think Chuck mentioned, and he was addressed by the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who called him a, quote, faithful and fearless champion of liberty. Congress voted Lafayette a national reward, $200,000 and a township, 23 acres in northern Florida. That was not chump change, by the way. A 2015 calculator tells us that $200,000 was worth about 3.2 million in 2015 dollars. Lafayette died on May 20th, 1834, and was buried in Pequot Cemetery. President Jackson gave Lafayette the same military honors as John Adams had ordered at Washington's death. There were eulogies in churches and state legislatures and in private societies. Edward Everett gave a 2-hour eulogy, it's 100 pages long, in Faneuil Hall. John Quincy Adams gave a similarly long eulogy to a joint session of Congress. He was then a congressman on December 31st, 1834. I will now answer the question which I know is on everybody's mind. Was Lafayette really buried in American soil? The answer is probably yes. And it's most likely soil from Bunker Hill. However, he did not take it back with him on the Brandywine in 1825. The story is that on July 4th, 1825, Lafayette was asked to help lay the cornerstone of a workingman's library, an apprentice library that this businessman who grew up in Charlestown, Massachusetts, by the name of William Wood, had held a subscription for. This was a project of, he was a very wealthy man. It was a project of his. He had done one in Nahant, Massachusetts. He had done one in Manhattan. And this was the third, he called them Apprentices Library. A conversation occurred in which he asked Lafayette if he would help him try to do that in France. He, Mr. Wood, would send soil from Bunker Hill for his burial. So the trail continues in 2 newspaper accounts in the Bunker Hill Aurora on May 16th, 1829. And I will quote, "A letter was received by the selectmen of the town on Thursday from the agent of General Lafayette in New York, mentioning the receipt of an order for a hogshead of earth from Bunker Hill battleground to be placed over the body of Lafayette at his decease." A hogshead is a pretty big quantity. It's like tobacco bales are in hogshead. A reply has been, it is to be accompanied by a certificate to be signed by 3 of the oldest veterans and soldiers in this town and shipped to Le Havre from New York or Boston. A reply has been forwarded to the agent that the request will be implicitly complied with by the authorities of this town. The earth will be taken from near the spot where General Warren fell, and the earth that drank the blood of Warren will surround the body of Lafayette. And then the other article that appears a week later says that an answer has been received by the agent in New York, and that the Massachusetts Mechanics Association have it in contemplation to furnish the cask made of oak from Concord and Lexington. So that's where the trail ends. I mean, we don't have proof that it actually arrived, but I think it's pretty likely based upon Mr. William Wood's efforts along those lines. So what was the significance of Lafayette's farewell tour? And I think I have identified 4 parts to this. First, and not necessarily in this order, by the way. First, Lafayette's arrival in the United States in August 1824 pacified the young country, which was in the midst of a vitriolic election campaign. The 5 candidates in the race included Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. This was the first presidential election without a candidate who was a member of the founding generation, the Revolutionary War generation. The November result was so close that the election got thrown to the House of Representatives. Lafayette's mere presence led to a temporary truce, if not a complete cessation of electoral hostilities. According to Lafayette's private secretary, Auguste Levasseur, quote, "For nearly 2 months, all hostilities, as well as all the emotions excited by the election, were forgotten, and one could only think anymore of Lafayette and the heroes of the Revolution." There were 2 reasons for this. One was the sense of patriotism that Lafayette's presence inspired in Americans, and the other was that news of Lafayette crowded the rancorous political columns off the front pages of the nation's newspapers, in many cases, and provided a steady dose of favorable, even joyful, alternative news. Second, Lafayette's 13-month visit restored a sense of pride and patriotism in the new generation on the cusp of the Jubilee year 1826. The welcoming speeches across the country dwelled on the improvements in commerce, agriculture, population growth, the arts, and education. In his replies, Lafayette spoke admiringly of the progress he observed throughout the nation. Americans attributed these successes to the republic which Lafayette had played a major part in founding. One New Hampshire Freemason went so far as to exclaim, quote, "Whatever is lovely or exalted in the social and political conditions of America, we contemplate with enthusiasm as the monument of your virtues." The repetition of these themes all over the country, which was reported widely in the public press, engendered a strong current of renewed patriotism throughout the land. As Lucy Penn Holland wrote after meeting Lafayette at a ball in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, "Meeting Lafayette was, quote, one of the happiest moments of my life. Being able to thank him personally for his service to America," she wrote, "made me feel 10 times more of an American than I ever did before." Third, the farewell tour set off a naming frenzy, as well as the erection of over 20 Lafayette statues and monuments. In addition to the 80 cities, towns, and counties, thousands of streets, there are numerous schools named for Lafayette. There are public squares, and about 75 Masonic lodges are called Lafayette Lodges. Finally, Lafayette's tour solidified Lafayette's role as the go-to symbol of Franco-American friendship. Did you know that the inspirational spark for the Statue of Liberty was lit in the 1860s when Edouard Laboulaye, the principal promoter of the enterprise, and Frédéric Bartholdi, the sculptor, discussed how the Americans honored Lafayette and the French volunteers as much as they honored their own patriots? Did you know that the principal address at the 1886 inauguration of the statue, given by Peekskill, New York orator and later U.S. Senator Chauncey Depew, was essentially a biography of Lafayette. Mr. Depew began his oration this way: "The story of Lafayette's life is the history of the time that made possible this statue, and his spirit is the very soul of this celebration." He continued, "The alliance with France during the American Revolution assured our triumph, and Lafayette assured the alliance. Even in modern times, during every state visit of a French president, Lafayette and his role in the American Revolution are referenced in speeches and toasts. One member of the American Friends of Lafayette calculated that when President Macron visited in 2018, Lafayette was mentioned a total of 21 times in the various speeches and toasts." I will end this talk with an obituary, not of Lafayette, we'd be here all night, but of an obscure Philadelphian by the name of David Kramer. Kramer died in Philadelphia during the blizzard of 1888. Didn't die of the blizzard, but he happened to die during. The bolded headline in this obituary is, and I quote, "A man who knew Lafayette dead." David Kramer died on Monday evening, the 12th, after several months' illness of a complication of diseases in the 73rd year of his age. Now keep that in mind, he was 73 in 1888. He many years ago resided in Philadelphia, where he was a contractor and erected many fancy dwellings for the leading men of that city. He was a member of the F&AM, the Freemasons, Carpenters Association, which was a high-end guild, and the IO of OF, the Oddfellows, and at one time was an active member of the city council. So he's a very accomplished person. And then here's the buried lead. In his youth, he had the pleasure of seeing and conversing with General Lafayette during his last visit to America. Well, if you do the math, David Kramer, a successful builder and city councilor, was 9 years old when he, along with 5,000 other school children, the newspaper account says 70 schools sent 70 children each to this event, met Lafayette outside Independence Hall on October 4th, 1824, and that was apparently the most important event of his life. Thank you.
Thank you. I was wanting to ask if there was a plan to stop by Lafayette Public School in Washington, D.C., Broad Branch Road, Northampton to Patterson Street. It's about 5 miles from where we're sitting.
Yes, and as it turns out, President Hoffman spoke at Lafayette School several years ago. And yes, in 2025, we have an event at that lovely school who has a bust of Lafayette in their foyer. So we'll be there, I promise.
It's my understanding Lafayette made a quote in the Revolutionary era that the cause of America is the cause of France and liberty. But I think it was later when he came back, and I'm wondering when he made another quote that, and I'm not sure if this is completely accurate, but that he wouldn't have lifted his sword had he known that it would turn into a slave empire or something to that effect. When did he make that latter quote?
You're talking about the statement, "I would never have drawn my sword for the cause of America had I known that I was thereby helping to create a nation of slavery." That quote was made privately to Thomas Clarkson, the British abolitionist who was a close friend. The first time that quote surfaced was 12 years after Lafayette died in 1846. Clarkson wrote a letter to a lady who was the deputy editor of the Liberator, the Garrison newspaper, and the letter was published on January 2, 1846. And it became kind of a rallying cry for the abolitionists because, as you see, in 1846, Lafayette was the most popular man in America. So to have him say this was very important to them. They used it in speeches, etc.
A few years ago, I read an article describing a tour that President Washington took through many American states during his presidency. And that was a time of factionalism and disagreements. And Washington, advanced as he was in age, still went on that tour in an attempt to kind of pull the country together. So I'm wondering if the president who invited Lafayette to come and do his tour was inspired to issue that invitation by Washington's trip around the country.
Yeah. Well, James Monroe made a similar tour himself. So possibly, I mean, maybe James Monroe was inspired by Washington or Washington's tour. One interesting sidelight, Washington during that tour stayed at the Tracy Mansion in Newburyport. And that was in the 1790s, something like 1792, maybe three. But Lafayette slept in the same bed in 1824. That's in Newburyport. Yeah.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
He was only supposed to stay for 3 months. Neither of us said that. Only 3 months. He stayed for 13 months because all the other states were like, well, what about me? What about me? And one more thing I want to add that I didn't say when I was talking is I talked about that Fort McHenry event that we're going to have, which is really going to be special on October 7th. The person organizing that event is in the room tonight, and that's Jackie Nauer. And I want to say thank you to Jackie.
I just thought it was interesting, the image of LaGrange in his home at Lars Anderson Park, which was created by the Anderson family. Their carriage house, which still exists, is the spitting image of that.
Oh,
And my other point was when Lafayette visited Montpelier, he lectured Madison over the issue of slavery, and they had a tense discussion.
yeah. He was lobbying for the manumission of slaves with all of his Virginia friends, in particular, with Jefferson, Madison, John Marshall. He sent John Marshall a anti-slavery pamphlet in 1825. So he was trying, to get them around to his position. He thought it was wrong, slavery, but he also would tell them that when I try to sell American doctrines to the old Europe, everyone, they hit me with the slavery issue. Why should we follow American doctrines? And that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to introduce American doctrines, political doctrines, to Europe.
Yes, on Lagrange there, if you can go visit it. You have
You have to speak up, Pierre.
yes, so Lagrange, you can go visit it. It's about an hour and a half from Paris, east of Paris, maybe less. You have to order before. You have to warn the people, and they will let you visit it. But what's interesting is that in one of the room, there is a plaque on the wall, hidden with a cover. Felt, and they take it out and they say this is the other original of the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson gave to Lafayette, and the other one is at the National Library, I think, here. So if you go to Lagrange, you can go and see the second original of the Declaration of Independence of the United States. Quite impressive.
He had the Declaration of Rights right next to it. When he lived in Paris in the 1780s, he left a space next to his copy of the Declaration. He said someday there'll be a Declaration of Rights, which he helped write in 1789.
Is there any truth to the matter that, to the question that Lafayette visited the booming metropolis of Paris, Virginia?
What is the name of
Paris,
it?
Virginia.
Paris.
Paris? I'm not, I've never heard that.
I don't think so. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. He went to Versailles, though. He went to Versailles. Mr. Stroop.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, Alan, for your presentation and your leadership with American Friends of Lafayette. I came from Indiana, and my question is the unfaithful sinking of the Mechanic in the Ohio River. Things were possibly lost. What items are you aware of that was maybe lost during the ship sinking?
Well, we believe his dog was lost. He had a dog. John Bessick can tell us about that. Also, correspondence was lost, a lot of correspondence.
And for a moment, he thought he lost his son.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
It was dicey.
And I'm going to recreate that. I'm going to kill a dog.
No. He loved dogs, by the way. He at his home in La Grange, there's a dog cemetery. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a question. So this is kind of relating to when he first came to America. But I read that Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane were told not to let any other French noblemen become officers in the army. How did Lafayette gain access to?
Actually, it was Benjamin Franklin that made it possible because a letter arrived to Philadelphia indicating that, I'm sorry, it was Benjamin Franklin that kind of made it possible. They were sick and tired of French military officers coming over just for glory or money or whatever it was. And they actually turned Lafayette away the first time on July of 1777. However, they got a letter the next day from Benjamin Franklin saying, this guy, the Marquis de Lafayette, he's the richest man in Europe, and you probably want to take him in. And so they ran to his hotel and grabbed him, and he promised to serve for free. So that's what he did, and the rest is history. So it was a little dicey in the beginning, but Benjamin Franklin actually helped the cause. They were upset with Silas Deane because Silas Deane was letting anybody over, but then they eventually asked him to tap the brakes on that. But it was Benjamin Franklin that opened the door.
Yeah, and I read it was because part of it they let Silas Deane especially let a lot of people in who he thought had connections to like the king and the court because he didn't want to anger the European royalty.
Was that Silas Deane did that?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that, you know.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear.
I think I read that Silas Deane let a lot of Frenchmen in who were kind of high in the king's court because he didn't want to like jeopardize any sort of relationship with the French government.
I'm not sure about that, but he, basically what the Americans wanted were engineers, French engineers who would design fortifications. They felt they were weak in that. And Silas Deane just allowed a lot of officers. He gave them purported commissions. And the problem was that a lot of these gentlemen couldn't speak English. They were arrogant, and they were insisting on higher ranks than maybe the American authorities believed they should have. So they were a pain to General Washington.
Hi, do you have any information or can you verify if it's true that he actually visited the Arlington House and stayed with George Washington Parke Custis in 1824 in Virginia?
Could you come a little closer, ma'am, so we could hear better? Or
Oh, yes.
Is it true that he visited the Arlington House in Virginia and spent time with George Washington Parke Custis?
many, many, many times. And also Woodlawn, where also George Washington's family was. He visited them many times, especially during the winter between 1824 and 1825. We are holding an event on Columbus Day, which I think is October 13th at the Arlington House. So we'll be there on October 13th. Okay.
Thank you. I understand that Lafayette got hurt at Brandywine by a bullet from the British into his leg and fell off his horse, and one man brought him back up, and I understand that man was James Monroe. Is it true?
Well, I think 200,000 people saw Willie Mays make that catch over his shoulder. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but a lot of people claim to have helped Lafayette that day. James Monroe might have been one of them. What do you think, Alan?
No, but
Lafayette had been shot. Thank you. When Washington heard that Lafayette had been shot, he not only sent his own personal physician, Dr. Corcoran, to take care of him, but he also picked a certain French captain by the name of James Monroe, who had been heroic at the Battle of Trenton, and he asked Captain Monroe to remove Lafayette from the field of Brandywine to avoid being captured by the British, and then take him on to Bethlehem, where he recovered. So it was Monroe who actually escorted, with some other troops, Lafayette away from Brandywine to Bethlehem.
so just to follow up on that, Pierre, in the exhibition, which you should look at, there is here at Anderson House, there's a guy who was about 101 years old, and he claimed to be the one who carried Lafayette off the field. And it turns out it was just a complete nonsense. He wasn't even there that day or stuff like that. But anyhow, he became very famous doing that. And if you read through the newspaper accounts of the farewell tour, there must be 10 people who claim to be the person to carry Lafayette off the field. You know.
If I may, that's really why we lost the Battle of Brandywine. Everybody was too busy helping Lafayette off the field. All right, I think we do have some questions from Zoom, if you guys wouldn't mind taking a few more. One viewer would like to know who paid for all of this when Lafayette was here.
Are you
Was it the
talking
American
about
Friends of
1824 or
Lafayette, or-
2024? Because we're still raising money for 2024.
Oh, the localities did. The city of New York paid, like Boston paid for it in Boston, like we just heard about today. The local towns, Concord, I'm thinking Concord, and you know what happened in Concord, Massachusetts, is that the town fathers paid for a collation on the common, and they excluded the ordinary people. So the ordinary people refused to reimburse the town. In other words, they voted against paying those bills. So it was the localities all over the country who did it. Yeah.
Thank you. We do have a question. Was Lafayette respected and admired by the French like he was here in America at the time?
That's a long answer.
We have until midnight. Go ahead. No, I'm just kidding.
Was he admired in 1824?
No, in France.
When though?
In France, like he was here in the United States.
Is there a time frame we
Yeah,
could
what's
be on?
the time frame?
Well, then, and the next question I'm going to dovetail into is, how is Lafayette thought of in France today? How is he taught in schools? What's the?
I'll deal with
Which one are you gonna?
I'll do the history. You do today.
Go ahead.
All right, I'll try not that one. So Lafayette did something during the French Revolution that was very difficult to do. He tried to keep both sides happy. Constitutional monarchy, it just wasn't going to work. He thought it would work. He was friends with the king. He wanted to keep the monarchy going, but he understood that there needed to be some kind of constitutional situation. There needed to be a government like the United States. And he tried to do both things. And you know what happens when you make two people ever try to keep everybody happy? You make nobody happy. And that's what ended up happening. Ended up in jail. So the thinking about Lafayette was he was super, super popular early on in the revolution, because that's before the Jacobins took hold. But as time went on, that eroded, and then eventually he had to flee France.
No, I think that's right. So, you know, the French have long memories. And as Chuck indicated, Lafayette was hated by the left and the right. The monarchists hated him too. They blamed him for starting the revolution. Basically, he's not greatly popular today in France, probably for that reason. In 2007, President Sarkozy floated the idea of moving his body from Picpus Cemetery to the Pont d'Aon. And no one liked that idea. I mean, the family didn't like it either, but there was an editorial or an op-ed in, I think it's Le Monde, which is sort of to the left. And they ripped the whole idea and blamed Lafayette for betraying called him a traitor for betraying the revolution. Now, what they were commenting on is he went over the border to Belgium after the Jacobins sent a commission to arrest him in 1792. But that was a betrayal of the revolution to do that. So on the other hand, a poll was taken, and he's like second to Napoleon, really, among the French. So
after we're done educating Americans about Lafayette, we're going to France and we're going to do it there.
All right, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Alan, Chuck, thank you very much for coming out. Thank you all for attending in person and online. And we thank you for your support of our mission. So get home safe, and thanks for coming out.